friends, my name is Marinés, and today I'll be reviewing The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas. So much has already been said about this YA contemporary inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement. For a little while, I wasn't sure that I was going to make a review of my own for that very reason, but then I just reminded myself that I made this channel to talk to you guys about my feelings about books, and so I really just wanted to tell you how much I loved this book. My overall experience with The Hate U Give was a little complex. I pre-ordered it, so it was actually in my hands on the release date, but I wasn't able to get into it when I first started trying to read it. I'm usually pretty good about pinpointing why a book doesn't grab me or why it isn't for me, but I wasn't entirely sure when it came to this book why my first attempt kind of missed. My best guess is that I sometimes struggle with books that have some kind of clear defining hook or plot feature that we know is coming but still gets built up to in the beginning of the book. We know going into The Hate U Give that Star's childhood friend Khalil is shot by the police while he was unarmed. And yet there's still the work to be done of introducing all of the characters and putting them in positions to lead up to this thing that we know is going to happen. I know that it's necessary and all books go through doing their introductions, but I think that it was in laying that groundwork that I got a little bit lost and I put this book down and didn't immediately pick it back up again. This past April, I was in California and I met up with my best friend Nicole, and she mentioned having recently read The Hate U Give. I mentioned to her that I had tried to pick it up and I felt that the beginning was a little draggy, and I registered a brief second of "girl, what?" in her reaction, so I decided to just give the book another try, and on my flight back from LA to Fort Lauderdale, I read the entire book just like in one sitting. I read the entire book on a plane, and I also openly cried on the plane. What I found was a deeply moving story, and I will say that my initial reaction was that while it was an incredibly important story, it was lacking a little bit of complexity and nuance. Perhaps because it was being marketed as a story about the Black Lives Matter movement, I was very focused on that single aspect of the story, and it wasn't until I finished and I let it kind of settle and just really looked at the overall story that I began to see where the nuance and complexity really was. For anybody who has been a part of the conversation about Black Lives Matter or who has any kind of foundation in talking about diversity and representation, there are a lot of things here that will feel familiar to you. The nuance that Angie brings to the conversation, to her story, really comes because she creates three-dimensional characters. Star is dealing with living in the poorer neighborhood that she grew up in, but attending school in a wealthier neighborhood, and just how existing in those different spheres can lead a person to feel split, and the code switching that happens, and the antagonism that you face even from people who call themselves your friends. In losing her childhood best friend, she faces growing up and growing apart, and what those things mean for mourning her friend. She and the other characters in the story deal with how you reconcile a person and the bad decisions that they make, and how much that informs your idea of them as a person. She deals with issues of being in a non-nuclear family. And of course, we deal with Khalil's death, the different reactions to it, and the very idea of having people measure and comment on the value of a human life. I really enjoyed Star as a main character. She's got a braveness and a brashness and a personality that was really able to carry the story, and yet she was vulnerable enough that we saw her struggle through something that is clearly so very terrible. I can barely imagine what it would be like to go through something like that, and yet the author manages to put us right in the heart of it at the moment and at the terrifying moments that follow. One of the big themes of the entire story was that of using your voice and finding your voice, and I think it was so clever to use someone like Star who has this personality and showing them in all of these different facets, where she's, more quiet at her school because of the way that people perceive her, but a little louder in the neighborhood because she's overcompensating for being more absent. She's quiet in a sense after the death of Khalil because what it will mean for her to speak up. In a story that is so timely and so important, I love the theme of finding your voice and how it trickled into other aspects of the story, from Star learning to speak up about some of the antagonisms that she's facing at school, to being able to tell her parents about some of the things in her life that she was keeping a secret. Now, more than I liked Star, I loved her parents. We have an ongoing joke over on Snark Squad that you're becoming an adult when you find more interest in the parent drama of teen shows. It all started because of the OC and how we were finding that we were compelled by the parent stories a little more than we were when we were actually teenagers. I love these parents so incredibly much, specifically because it is rather difficult to find good parents in YA. And I think that's for a multitude of reasons, but for the most part, in my experience, you encounter it a lot out of convenience because you have these teens that need to have adventures, and the best way for them to be able to have whatever adventures or conflict is for the parents to be absent. And the easiest way for the parents to be absent is to write them negligently or absently, or just kind of remove them from the situation. So to have a story where the parents are present, where they're good parents, where they're complex, obviously, I'm like gushing about this now. I love them. They were loving towards their children. They loved each other, and they weren't perfect, but they always had their children's best interest at heart. To me, they were really the backbone of the story, especially in the way that they were able to hold Star's hand and help her reach a place where she could make decisions about what she wanted to do and what she wanted to say in the aftermath of Khalil's death. A lot of the character work is done within Star's family, and for a book that really does hinge on this one defining plot moment, the rest of it for me was very much carried by the characters. As kind of an aside, I remember when Luke Cage came out, and I haven't watched it, but I remember there being a lot of hubbub about the fact that most, if not all, of the cast were people of color. I wish I would have saved the tweet, but there was a tweet that I saw that was kind of joking about yes, white people of color do sit down and talk to each other when you're not around, and that sarcasm, obviously the joke, led to a discussion about having conversations amongst people of color and why that there is value in own voices stories and being able to speak to those experiences firsthand. There was so much of that authenticity that Thomas was able to capture and convey via this book, from everything in the way that Star talked to her brothers and her parents and the way that they all addressed each other in the neighborhood. I just wanted to briefly mention how impressed I was by the way that Thomas was able to capture that and make it accessible to her readers. For the most part, I enjoyed the writing style, and it was definitely one of those it made me laugh, it made me cry kind of books. I was further impressed by the way that Thomas was able to weave in those strands of humor, and I think it speaks so well to the experience of grief and how much grief is learning to deal with it while life moves on and the world moves on. You laugh one second, you cry the next, and that was certainly portrayed in Star's story. Additionally, the fact of racism is that it's something that you live with. And in showing these everyday moments and having this humor just coupled inside of the story, she really conveyed that it isn't separate. It is all part of a lived experience. Thomas manages to really humanize a story that we sometimes only see one-dimensionally through the lens of the media and what they choose to portray. Personally, I will say that I thought that there were places within the story where the descriptions and the writing could have been tightened up. You guys know how much I love descriptive and flowery language, but I always feel like it has to enhance the story. When you find yourself skipping over things to kind of get to the meat of it is when I feel like you've maybe reached a point where you could tighten it, and I felt that way a couple of times throughout The Hate U Give. I am pretty stoked to see what Thomas does in the future, because part of me thinks that some of that tightening up will come as she publishes more, and just thinking that this is her debut novel is incredible. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. If you haven't read it already, I highly encourage you to do so. If you have read it, come talk to me down in the comments about how much you love Star's parents. I'm kidding, but I'm kind of not. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. The first example that always pops into my head of having kind of that very defining plot thing and still leading up to it is The Selection by Kier Cass. You spend like 25% of that book building up to the selection when you already know that she goes through with it and gets selected because it's the whole premise.